music had barely reached its second measure when Evelina Ashworth felt the room begin to spin. She pressed her gloved hand against the cold marble pillar beside her, willing her knees to hold. Her breath came fast and shallow, and the chandeliers above blurred into golden smears of light. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, yet now that it was actually happening, her body refused to cooperate with her plan. Lord Pembroke had cornered her only minutes earlier, his voice low and insistent, reminding her that her father expected an answer to his proposal before the night was through. Evelina had smiled, nodded, and excused herself with a practiced grace, but inside she was screaming. She could not marry a man twice her age, who spoke to her as though she were a prize horse he intended to purchase. She needed an escape, and she needed it now. So she had decided to fake a faint. It was not her finest idea, she knew that, but desperate women in desperate ballrooms did desperate things, and Evelina Ashworth was nothing if not desperate. She let her knees buckle slightly, tilted her head back, and allowed her body to fall backward into what she hoped would look like a dramatic swoon. What she had not planned for was missing the soft velvet chair she had aimed for by nearly 2 feet. The floor rushed up to meet her, and for one terrifying second, she braced for pain. Instead, she felt strong arms close around her waist, catching her mid-fall with an ease that suggested the man doing the catching had done this before, though certainly not under these exact circumstances. "Nice attempt," a low voice murmured near her ear, amused rather than alarmed. Evelina's eyes flew open. She found herself staring up into the face of a man she recognized instantly, though they had never been formally introduced. Duke Alistair Wren. Every unmarried woman in the room knew his name, his fortune, and the particular way he seemed to look through people, rather than at them. Right now, he was looking directly at her, and there was no missing the glint of humor in his dark eyes. "I beg your pardon?" she whispered, her voice cracking, despite her best effort to sound faint and delicate. "You heard me," he said quietly, still holding her upright, as though she weighed nothing at all. "A feint, was it? You went down at quite the wrong angle, for someone who had actually lost consciousness. Most people fall forward, not backward, when their legs truly give out." Evelina felt heat rush into her cheeks. Of all the people in this crowded ballroom, of all the guests who might have witnessed her poorly executed performance, it had to be him, the one man in London whose opinion could make or break a woman's entire season, with a single sentence spoken to the right ears. "I do not know what you mean," she said, straightening herself and stepping out of his grip as quickly as propriety allowed. "I simply felt unwell." "Of course," he said, his tone suggesting he believed nothing of the sort. "Shall I call for your maid? Or perhaps," he added, glancing toward Lord Pembroke, who was now hurrying across the ballroom floor with obvious concern, "you would prefer I simply walk you somewhere quieter before your admirer arrives to fuss over you?" Evelina's eyes widened. He had seen through her plan entirely, and worse, he seemed to understand exactly why she needed to escape. Without waiting for her answer, he took her arm and guided her toward a set of doors leading to a private drawing room just off the main hall, moving with the kind of quiet authority that made servants step aside and guests avert their eyes. "You cannot simply lead me away like this," she protested under her breath, though she made no move to pull free. "I am the host's cousin," he said simply, as though this explained everything. "No one will question it. Besides, you looked like you needed rescuing from something far worse than a fall." The drawing room was blessedly quiet after the noise of the ballroom, lit only by a low fire and a single lamp on the writing desk. Evelina sank onto a settee, finally allowing herself to breathe properly for the first time all evening. Alistair remained standing near the door, his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You may go now," she said, attempting to sound composed. "I assure you I am perfectly well." "I am certain you are," he replied, not moving an inch. Well enough to attempt an entire performance to avoid a marriage proposal, at least. Evelina's head snapped up. "How could you possibly know that?" "I did not, until just now," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But your face tells me everything I need to know. You are correct. I did not know for certain until you confirmed it yourself." She let out a frustrated breath, torn between embarrassment and a strange, unexpected relief at being so thoroughly understood by a stranger. Lord Pembroke wishes to marry me. My father wishes it as well. I wish for neither of these things, but wishes, as you may have noticed, rarely matter much for women in my position. Alistair's expression shifted, something more serious replacing the earlier amusement. He moved closer, taking a seat across from her, close enough to speak quietly without raising his voice. You are not alone in that particular struggle, he said. Though my circumstances differ, I find myself facing a similar sort of pressure. My mother has taken it upon herself to parade no fewer than 6 eligible young women before me this season alone, each one more determined than the last to secure my hand. Forgive me if I do not weep for your troubles, your grace, Evelina said, a touch of dry humor slipping into her voice despite herself. A duke's burden of too many suitors seems rather different from a woman's fear of being sold to the highest bidder. Perhaps, he acknowledged, tilting his head, though I did not say our situations were identical, only that we share an unwillingness to be herded into a match neither of us has chosen. Evelina studied him for a long moment, trying to determine whether this was simply idle conversation or something more purposeful. His eyes held hers steadily, and there was nothing mocking in his gaze now, only a quiet, considering sort of attention that made her feel oddly exposed. What is it you want, your grace? She finally asked. You did not have to catch me, and you certainly did not have to bring me here. Men in your position rarely trouble themselves with the schemes of women they have never met. Perhaps I found your scheme more entertaining than the ball itself, he said. Or perhaps I saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to something more private, more direct. A solution. For both of us. Evelina's brow furrowed. Explain yourself. You wish to avoid Lord Pembroke's proposal. I wish to avoid my mother's endless parade of hopeful brides. If the two of us were to be seen together, courting, even briefly, it would solve both our problems rather neatly. Your father could hardly insist you accept Lord Pembroke while a duke is actively pursuing your hand, and my mother could hardly continue introducing me to strangers while I am publicly attached to someone else. Evelina blinked, certain she had misheard him. You are suggesting we pretend to court one another? I am suggesting exactly that, he said, entirely unbothered by how absurd the proposal sounded spoken aloud. Nothing real, of course. No promises, no expectations, beyond what is necessary to convince society we are sincere. A temporary arrangement, ended whenever either of us wishes it. That is the most ridiculous plan I have ever heard, Evelina said, though even as the words left her mouth, she found herself considering it. It was ridiculous. It was also, perhaps, exactly what she needed. Ridiculous plans have a curious way of working, precisely because no one expects them, Alistair said. Tell me, Miss Ashworth, do you have a better solution readily available? One that does not involve fainting into the arms of strange men at balls? Evelina opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She did not, in fact, have a better solution. She had spent weeks trying to think of one, and the best she had managed was tonight's poorly executed collapse, which had only succeeded in landing her in this drawing room, with a duke she barely knew, discussing a proposal that defied every rule of proper behavior she had been raised to follow. How would we even begin such a thing? She asked slowly, testing the idea aloud, as though speaking it might reveal its flaws more clearly. We begin exactly as any courtship begins, Alistair said. A dance tonight, perhaps. A carriage ride tomorrow. Small, visible gestures that the right people will notice and discuss. Society does the rest of the work for us. Gossip spreads faster than any announcement we could make ourselves. And when it ends, what then? I will be the woman a duke grew tired of. My reputation will suffer far more than if I had simply married Lord Pembroke and endured a lifetime of misery and silence. Alistair considered this carefully, and Evelina appreciated that he did not dismiss her concern outright. We shall end it carefully then. A mutual parting, framed however best protects your standing. I am not without resources, Miss Ashworth, nor without influence over how a story is told. I promise you this much. I will not allow you to emerge from this arrangement worse than you entered it. That is a great deal to promise a woman you met less than an hour ago. Perhaps, he said, but I find myself inclined to keep it nonetheless. Evelina studied his face again, searching for some hidden motive, some deeper scheme she had not yet uncovered. She found only steady, quiet sincerity. which unsettled her more than outright deception might have. Men who wanted something from her usually made their intentions plain within minutes. This man seemed to want nothing beyond exactly what he had described. "Why me?" she asked finally. Surely there are other women who would gladly play along with such a scheme. Women eager for the attention of a duke, however temporary. "Because you tried to fake a faint, rather than simply marry a man you despise," Alistair said, a faint smile returning to his lips. "That tells me you have more courage than sense, Miss Ashworth, and I find that combination rather rare among the women my mother keeps introducing me to." Despite herself, Evelina laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch them both off guard. "That is hardly a compliment, Your Grace." "It was meant as one," he said, "though I understand, if you require time to consider my proposal. It is, after all, a significant decision, however temporary the arrangement." Evelina glanced toward the door, aware that Lord Pembroke was likely still searching for her, that her father was likely growing anxious over her prolonged absence, that the entire evening balanced on a decision she needed to make quickly. She thought of the years stretching ahead of her as Lord Pembroke's wife, of his cold, assessing gaze whenever he looked at her, of the life she would live if she did nothing at all. "Very well," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace. Though I reserve the right to end this arrangement the moment it becomes more trouble than it is worth." "A fair condition," Alistair said, rising and extending his hand toward her. "Shall we return to the ballroom then? I believe a dance would serve our purposes rather well." Evelina hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. As they walked back toward the doors leading to the noise and light of the ballroom, she felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration settle into her chest, the sense that she had just stepped onto a path with no clear end, guided by a man she barely knew, and a plan built on nothing but shared desperation. The music swelled as they re-entered the ballroom, and heads turned immediately, whispers beginning before they had even crossed half the floor. Evelina caught sight of Lord Pembroke's stunned expression from across the room, and beside him, her father's confused frown, both men clearly trying to make sense of why the Duke of Wren had emerged from a private room with Evelina Ashworth on his arm. Alistair led her onto the dance floor without hesitation, his hands settling at her waist as the orchestra began a new waltz. Evelina found her feet moving automatically, years of dance lessons taking over where her nerves threatened to fail her. "You are doing very well, Miss Ashworth," Alistair murmured as they turned. "Almost as though you have not just agreed to the most scandalous arrangement of your season. I suspect I shall regret this by morning," Evelina admitted quietly. "Perhaps," he said, "but tonight, at least, you are no longer trapped." As they moved through the dance, Evelina caught glimpses of the room around them, the widening eyes, the leaning heads, the fans lifted to hide whispered speculation. Whatever she had started tonight, there would be no undoing it now. The only path left was forward, into whatever strange, uncertain territory this arrangement would lead them both. And somewhere beneath her fear, hidden carefully where she did not yet wish to examine it too closely, Evelina felt something else stirring, something she refused to name just yet, as the Duke's hand remained steady at her waist, and the music carried them both deeper into a night neither of them could have predicted when it began. Morning arrived far too quickly for Evelina's liking. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling of her bedchamber, replaying the events of the previous night over and over, until they no longer seemed real. Had she truly agreed to pretend a courtship with the Duke of Wren? Had she truly danced with him in front of half of London, while her father and Lord Pembroke watched in stunned silence? The memory felt like something borrowed from a novel, rather than her own life. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her younger sister, Lucy, burst in, without waiting for permission, her eyes bright with excitement, and her hands clutching a folded newspaper. "You are in every column this morning," Lucy announced, dropping onto the edge of Evelina's bed. "The Duke of Wren danced with you 3 times last night. 3 times, Evelina. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand precisely what it means," Evelina said, sitting up and rubbing her temples. "It means Father will be asking questions before breakfast is finished." As if summoned by the mention of him, a firm knock sounded at the door moments later, followed by her father's voice requesting her presence downstairs immediately. Evelina exchanged a look with Lucy before rising and dressing quickly, her stomach tightening with each passing minute. Her father, Mr. Ashworth, stood by the window of his study when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that reminded her uncomfortably of the Duke the previous evening. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Would you care to explain last night's events?" he asked. "I danced with the Duke of Wren, father, that is all." "That is all," he repeated flatly. "Evelina, you disappeared for nearly 20 minutes before reappearing on the arm of one of the most sought-after men in England, and then proceeded to dance with him 3 times, while Lord Pembroke, a man who had every intention of proposing to you last night, stood watching in humiliation. That is hardly nothing." Evelina forced herself to remain calm, remembering the careful story she and Alistair had discussed briefly, before parting ways the previous night. "The Duke and I share a mutual interest in one another, father. We spoke at length last night, and found ourselves rather well suited." Her father's eyebrows rose sharply. "A mutual interest? You have never so much as mentioned the Duke of Wren before last evening." "Some things develop quickly," Evelina said, holding his gaze steadily despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Her father studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between suspicion and the undeniable appeal of a match with a duke. Wealth, title, and influence were not things easily dismissed, whatever doubts he might harbor about the suddenness of the arrangement. "Lord Pembroke will require an explanation," he said finally. "I shall provide one, if necessary," Evelina replied, "though I suspect his pride will recover more easily than you imagine." Her father did not look entirely convinced, but he did not press further, and Evelina took the small mercy for what it was. She excused herself from the study as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart still pounding from the exchange. By mid-afternoon, a note arrived at the house, sealed with an unfamiliar crest. Evelina opened it in the privacy of her room, recognizing Alistair's neat handwriting immediately. The note was brief, simply requesting the pleasure of her company for a carriage ride through the park at 4 o'clock, should she find herself agreeable to the idea. Evelina smiled despite herself at the careful, formal wording, so different from the easy confidence he had shown the previous night. She arrived downstairs at the appointed hour, to find Alistair's carriage already waiting outside, and Alistair himself standing beside it, dressed impeccably and looking entirely unbothered by the curious glances of passers-by who recognized his crest. "Miss Ashworth," he greeted her with a slight bow as she approached. "I trust your father did not give you too much trouble this morning." "He gave me exactly the trouble I expected," Evelina said, allowing him to help her into the carriage. "Though I suspect the promise of a duke as a son-in-law softened his concerns considerably." "Fathers often are surprisingly practical creatures," Alistair said, settling into the seat across from her as the carriage began to move. "Mine certainly was, before he passed. Mothers, however, are an entirely different matter. Speaking of which, how did your mother receive the news?" Alistair's expression flickered briefly, something more complicated passing behind his eyes before he answered. "She was delighted, naturally. Perhaps too delighted. I fear she has already begun planning matters that neither of us has agreed to." "Such as?" "A dinner, for one. She wishes to host you at the family estate within the fortnight, to properly introduce you to relatives, who will undoubtedly ask questions we have not yet prepared answers for." Evelina felt a small knot of anxiety form in her stomach. "We agreed this would be simple. A few public appearances, nothing more. Family dinners were not part of our arrangement." "I am aware," Alistair said, his tone apologetic. "I did attempt to discourage her, but my mother is not easily dissuaded, once she has decided upon a course of action. I thought it best to warn you now, rather than allow you to be ambushed by the invitation." The carriage rolled through the park, passing familiar faces who nodded politely while their eyes lingered a moment too long on the pair inside. Evelina found herself growing accustomed to the attention, rather more quickly than she expected, though the added pressure of meeting Alistair's family so soon left her uneasy. "What is she like?" Evelina asked. "Your mother?" "Formidable," Alistair said, a faint smile touching his lips. "She has run our household with remarkable efficiency since my father's death, and she has strong opinions about nearly everything, particularly regarding who I ought to marry. I suspect she will like you rather more than she likes most of the women she has paraded before me, if only because you did not seek this arrangement out yourself." "That is a strange thing to find appealing in a potential daughter-in-law," My mother has grown weary of women who see only my title and fortune, Alistair said, his voice quieter now, more serious. She wishes for someone who might see something else in me, whatever that something else might be. Evelina studied him carefully, noticing for the first time a trace of weariness in his expression that had not been visible the previous night. And do you believe there is something else to see, Your Grace? I am uncertain, he admitted, though I confess I have not had many opportunities to find out, given how quickly most conversations turn toward matters of inheritance and estate. The carriage continued its slow circuit of the park, and Evelina found herself relaxing slightly, the conversation drifting away from the careful performance of their arrangement and into something that felt more genuine, more like two people simply talking, rather than two strangers maintaining a charade. Tell me something true then, Evelina said suddenly. Something no one else knows, since we are meant to know each other well enough to convince your entire family. Alistair considered this for a long moment before answering. I do not particularly enjoy hosting large gatherings, despite what my position requires of me. I find them exhausting, all that performance and small talk. I would rather spend an evening in the library, with a single book, than an entire ballroom full of guests. Evelina smiled at this, finding it rather easy to believe given how he had spoken to her the previous night, direct and unhurried, entirely unlike the practiced charm she had expected from a duke of his reputation. That is not so different from myself, in truth. I attend these events because I must, not because I take any real pleasure in them. Then perhaps our arrangement is not so far from the truth after all, Alistair said. Two people who would rather be elsewhere, pretending otherwise for the sake of everyone watching. The carriage ride continued for another hour, weaving through the park before returning Evelina to her home, just as the sun began its slow descent. As Alistair helped her down from the carriage, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his expression unreadable in the fading light. The dinner is in 2 weeks, he said. I understand, if you wish to withdraw from our arrangement before then. Meeting my family raises the stakes considerably, and I would not blame you for reconsidering. Evelina hesitated, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She thought of Lord Pembroke, of the life she had so narrowly escaped, of the strange, unexpected comfort she had found in this arrangement, despite its obvious risks. I have no intention of withdrawing, Your Grace, she said finally. Not yet, at least. Something shifted in his expression at her words, a flicker of relief perhaps, though it passed too quickly for her to be certain. Then I shall see you again before the dinner. There are matters we ought to discuss beforehand, details of our story that must remain consistent. Of course, Evelina said. Send word whenever you find it convenient. She watched his carriage depart from the front steps of her home, her mind already racing ahead toward the dinner, 2 weeks hence, toward the family she would soon meet, toward the questions she would need to answer, without revealing the truth of their arrangement. The stakes were rising faster than she had anticipated, and she was beginning to suspect that the careful boundaries they had established the previous night might prove far more difficult to maintain than either of them had first believed. Inside the house, Lucy was waiting eagerly in the front hall, practically vibrating with curiosity about the carriage ride. Evelina found herself recounting the conversation in careful, edited detail, omitting the parts that felt too private to share, even with her sister, the small moments of honesty that had passed between herself and the Duke that afternoon. That night, as she prepared for bed, Evelina found her thoughts returning again and again to Alistair's admission about the library, about his preference for quiet evenings over crowded ballrooms. It was such a small thing, hardly significant in the grand scheme of their arrangement, yet it lodged itself in her mind regardless. A single true thing shared between two people who had agreed, above all else, to keep everything between them false. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself the arrangement remained exactly as they had defined it, temporary and practical, nothing more. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering what other true things might emerge before their arrangement ran its course, and whether either of them would recognize the danger before it was too late to turn back. The Wren family estate stood at the end of a long gravel drive lined with ancient oak trees, their branches forming a canopy that cast dappled shadows across the path. Evelina had visited grand houses before, but nothing quite prepared her for the sheer scale of the building that emerged as the carriage rounded the final bend, its stone walls rising 3 stories high and stretching further than she could comfortably measure with her eyes. You look nervous, Alistair observed from beside her, having arrived at her home personally, to escort her, rather than sending the carriage alone. I am attending a dinner, where I must convince an entire family that I am courting their son with genuine affection, all while maintaining a story. We have only had 2 brief conversations to prepare, Evelina said. I believe nervous is a rather generous description of how I feel. You need only remember the basic details, Alistair said calmly. We met at the Pembroke Ball. I was struck by your wit and your courage. You found my company surprisingly tolerable, given my reputation. Everything else can remain vague, as new couples often prefer to keep certain matters private. And if your mother asks something we have not discussed, then you shall answer honestly, within reason, Alistair said. The best lies are built upon truth, Miss Ashworth. Answer with what you genuinely think or feel, simply framed as though it pertains to affection for me, rather than mere observation. Evelina found this advice somewhat comforting, though her nerves did not fully settle until the carriage came to a stop before the grand entrance, where a footman waited to open the door. Alistair stepped down first, offering his hand to help her descend, and together they climbed the wide stone steps toward the entrance, where an older woman stood waiting, her posture rigid and her expression carefully composed. Mother, Alistair said, may I present Miss Evelina Ashworth. The Dowager Duchess, Margaret Wren, studied Evelina with sharp, assessing eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of her son's gaze the night they had first met. Miss Ashworth, she said finally, extending a gloved hand, my son has spoken of you rather more than I expected, given how briefly you have known each other. I hope only favorably, Your Grace, Evelina said, curtsying properly. Favorably enough, Margaret said, a faint smile touching her lips, though it did not entirely reach her eyes. Come inside. Dinner will be served shortly, and I believe several of my relatives are eager to meet the woman who has managed to capture my son's attention so thoroughly. Evelina exchanged a brief glance with Alistair as they followed his mother inside, both of them understanding the unspoken warning embedded in her words. Whatever awaited them at dinner would require careful navigation, and Evelina found herself grateful for Alistair's steady presence beside her as they entered the grand dining hall. The room was filled with more relatives than Evelina had anticipated, aunts and cousins and distant relations she had never heard mentioned, all of them turning to observe her with open curiosity as she entered. She recognized the particular sharpness of their attention, the way society women assessed a potential newcomer, searching for weaknesses to exploit or advantages to claim. Dinner began smoothly enough, conversation flowing around topics of weather and recent social events, though Evelina remained acutely aware of the questions building beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface. Tell us, Miss Ashworth, said a woman introduced as Alistair's aunt, Lady Sinclair, her tone deceptively pleasant. How exactly did my nephew manage to win your affection so quickly? He has resisted rather determined efforts from far more eligible women for several seasons now. Evelina felt every eye at the table turn toward her, waiting for her answer. She glanced briefly at Alistair, who offered the barest hint of encouragement in his expression before she spoke. I confess I did not expect to find his company particularly agreeable at first, Evelina said carefully. His reputation had led me to believe he would be rather cold and distant. Instead, I found him surprisingly perceptive, and rather more honest than most gentlemen of his position tend to be. A ripple of amusement passed around the table, and Lady Sinclair's expression softened slightly. Honest, you say? That is rather an unusual quality to praise in a duke. I find it a rare and valuable one, regardless of a man's title, Evelina said, and beside her, she felt rather than saw Alistair's slight shift, as though her answer had surprised him in some way he had not expected. And you, Alistair, Lady Sinclair continued, turning her attention toward her nephew. What was it about Miss Ashworth that caught your interest so thoroughly? Alistair set down his glass slowly, his expression thoughtful as he considered his answer. She did not pretend to be impressed by me, he said finally. Most women I meet perform a version of themselves they believe I wish to see. Miss Ashworth simply spoke as herself, whether or not I found it agreeable. Evelina felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words, and she reminded herself firmly that this was merely part of their performance, nothing more than careful words designed to satisfy his curious relatives. Yet something in his tone had sounded genuine, in a way that unsettled her more than any rehearsed line could have. The dinner continued through several more courses, the questions gradually softening as the family seemed to accept the story presented to them. Though Evelina noticed Margaret Wren remained largely quiet throughout, observing rather than participating, her sharp eyes missing nothing. After dinner concluded, the guests began to disperse into smaller groups throughout the drawing rooms, and Evelina found herself briefly alone with Margaret near the tall windows overlooking the estate's gardens. "You handle scrutiny well, Miss Ashworth," Margaret said, her tone unreadable. "Better than most young women I have observed in your position." "Thank you, Your Grace." "I did not intend it entirely as a compliment," Margaret continued, turning to face her directly. "I have watched a great many women attempt to secure my son's affection over the years, each one performing whatever role she believed would please him most. You perform very well indeed, Miss Ashworth, perhaps too well." Evelina's heart quickened at the implication behind the older woman's words. "I do not understand your meaning, Your Grace." "Do you not?" Margaret's gaze sharpened further, studying her with an intensity that made Evelina wish to look away, though she forced herself to hold steady. "My son has been pursued relentlessly for years, and yet within a single fortnight, he has brought you before his entire family, with more visible attachment than I have witnessed in him toward anyone else. Forgive me if I find such a rapid development somewhat suspicious." "Perhaps some connections simply form more quickly than others," Evelina said carefully. "Perhaps," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she remained unconvinced. "I shall reserve my judgment for now, Miss Ashworth. But know this. I have protected my son from a great many schemes over the years, some far more subtle than whatever you may be attempting. If you mean him harm, I will discover it eventually, and I will not hesitate to act." Evelina swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the warning settle over her. "I have no wish to harm your son, Your Grace. Whatever you may suspect." Margaret studied her for a long moment longer, before finally offering a small nod, apparently satisfied for now, though clearly unwilling to fully release her suspicion. "We shall see, Miss Ashworth. Time reveals a great many things that words alone cannot." The older woman moved away to rejoin her other guests, leaving Evelina standing alone by the window, her heart still racing from the exchange. She glanced across the room, to find Alistair watching her from a distance, his expression questioning, clearly having noticed the tension of the conversation even from afar. He crossed the room to join her a few moments later, his voice low as he spoke. "What did she say to you?" "She suspects something is not quite right about our sudden attachment," Evelina admitted. "I do not believe she trusts our story entirely." Alistair's jaw tightened slightly. "My mother has spent years protecting our family from fortune hunters and schemers. Her suspicion, I am afraid, is rather difficult to earn release from once it takes hold. Perhaps we ought to reconsider this arrangement," Evelina said quietly. "If she begins investigating too closely, she may uncover the truth, and the consequences could prove far worse than either of us anticipated." "Perhaps," Alistair agreed, though something in his tone suggested reluctance rather than agreement. "Though I confess, I find myself less inclined toward ending things than I expected to feel by this point." Evelina glanced up at him, searching his expression for meaning behind the words, but before she could respond, another relative approached them, drawing them both back into conversation and away from the private moment that had briefly passed between them. The remainder of the evening proceeded without further incident, though Evelina remained acutely aware of Margaret's watchful gaze from across the room throughout the rest of the gathering. By the time Alistair escorted her back to the carriage for the journey home, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, though her mind remained restless, turning over every moment of the evening in careful detail. "Thank you for enduring that," Alistair said as the carriage began moving down the long drive. "I know my mother's scrutiny is not easily borne. She only wishes to protect you," Evelina said. "I cannot fault her for that, even if her suspicion makes our situation considerably more complicated." "No," Alistair agreed quietly, his gaze drifting toward the window as the estate disappeared behind them into darkness. "I suppose you cannot." They rode in silence for several minutes, the weight of the evening settling comfortably between them, despite the tension that had preceded it. Evelina found herself studying Alistair's profile in the dim carriage light, noticing the slight furrow in his brow, the careful set of his jaw, wondering what thoughts occupied him so thoroughly that he had grown quiet in a way she had not yet witnessed. "What troubles you?" she asked finally, unable to resist the question. Alistair turned to look at her, something unguarded flickering across his expression before he answered. I find myself wondering, Miss Ashworth, at what point our arrangement stopped feeling entirely like a performance to me. The words hung in the air between them, and Evelina found she had no ready answer, her own thoughts equally uncertain on the matter. The carriage continued through the darkness, carrying them both back toward London, and toward a truth neither of them seemed quite ready to fully acknowledge. 3 weeks passed, and the arrangement between Evelina and Alistair had settled into something resembling a routine, though neither of them named it as such. They attended the theater together, walked through public gardens where they knew they would be seen, and exchanged notes with increasing frequency, each one growing slightly less formal than the last. It was during a quiet afternoon at a garden party hosted by one of Alistair's distant cousins that Evelina first noticed the shift most clearly. They had wandered slightly apart from the other guests, finding a bench beneath a large willow tree, where the noise of the party faded into a pleasant murmur behind them. You have grown quiet, Alistair observed, settling beside her on the bench. Is something troubling you? Evelina hesitated before answering, uncertain how much honesty the moment called for. I have been thinking about how easily this has all become natural to me, she admitted. The notes, the outings, the conversations. I no longer feel as though I am performing a role when I speak with you. Alistair remained quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. I have noticed the same in myself, he said finally. I find I look forward to your company, rather more than I anticipated when we first devised this scheme. That is rather dangerous territory for two people who agreed to nothing beyond a temporary arrangement, Evelina said, though her voice lacked the conviction the words seemed to require. Dangerous, perhaps, Alistair agreed, though I find myself less concerned with danger than I once was. Evelina turned to study his expression, searching for any hint of teasing or performance in his words, but found only quiet sincerity looking back at her. Something warm unfurled in her chest at the sight, a feeling she had been carefully avoiding naming for weeks now. We agreed this would remain simple, she said softly. No real feelings involved. We agreed to a great many things at the outset of this arrangement, Alistair said. Though I confess, some of those agreements have grown rather difficult to honor as time has passed. Before Evelina could respond, a voice called out from across the garden, drawing their attention back toward the main gathering. Alistair's cousin was gesturing for them to rejoin the group, and the moment between them dissolved as quickly as it had formed, leaving Evelina with a strange, unsettled feeling that lingered long after they had returned to the party. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Evelina found herself unable to focus on anything beyond their conversation beneath the willow tree. She sat at her writing desk, a blank sheet of paper before her, uncertain what she intended to write, but unable to simply set the matter aside. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and Lucy entered, without waiting for an invitation, settling onto the edge of the bed, with the familiar ease of a younger sister who had long since abandoned formal boundaries between them. You have been distracted all evening, Lucy observed. Ever since you returned from the garden party. Did something happen between you and the Duke? Evelina considered deflecting the question, as she had done countless times over the past weeks, but something in Lucy's earnest expression made her hesitate. I believe, she said slowly, that our arrangement has become rather more complicated than either of us intended. Lucy's eyes widened with immediate understanding. You have developed real feelings for him. I did not say that, Evelina protested, though the denial felt hollow even to her own ears. You did not need to, Lucy said, a knowing smile spreading across her face. I have watched you these past weeks, Evelina. You speak of him differently than you speak of anyone else. Your entire demeanor changes when his notes arrive. Evelina pressed her palms against her eyes, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of her sister's observation. This was never meant to become real, Lucy. We agreed to a temporary arrangement, nothing more. If real feelings enter into this, everything becomes far more complicated than either of us can afford. Why does complicated matter, if the feelings themselves are genuine? Lucy asked, settling closer to her sister. You deserve happiness, Evelina, not merely an escape from Lord Pembroke's proposal. If the Duke makes you happy, perhaps that matters rather more than the careful boundaries you established weeks ago. Evelina wanted to believe her sister's words, wanted to embrace the simplicity of the sentiment, but years of careful caution held her back. She had been burned before, in ways Lucy did not fully understand, Ways that had taught her the danger of trusting too quickly, of believing a man's affection when circumstances suggested otherwise. "It is not so simple," Evelina said quietly. "There are things about my past that complicate matters further, things I have not yet shared with the Duke." Lucy's expression softened with concern. "Do you intend to tell him?" "I do not know," Evelina admitted. "If our arrangement remains merely a performance, there is no need for such honesty. But if it has become something more, as you suggest, then perhaps he deserves to know the truth before matters progress any further." Lucy squeezed her sister's hand gently. "Whatever you decide, Evelina, know that I support you. You have carried this burden alone for too long already." After Lucy departed for her own bedchamber, Evelina remained at her writing desk long into the night, her thoughts circling endlessly around the conversation with Alistair, around her sister's words, around the secret she had guarded so carefully for the past 2 years. She thought of her previous engagement, of the humiliation that had followed its collapse, of the careful reputation she had rebuilt in the aftermath, through sheer determination and quiet caution. If she allowed herself to trust Alistair fully, if she allowed their arrangement to become the genuine attachment it seemed to be growing into, she risked exposing herself to that same vulnerability again. Yet the alternative, continuing to guard her heart so carefully that she denied herself any possibility of real happiness, felt increasingly unbearable as the weeks passed. The following morning, a note arrived from Alistair requesting her company for a walk through the park, and Evelina found herself dressing with more care than usual, her nerves already anticipating the conversation that seemed inevitable between them, now that the boundaries of their arrangement had grown so uncertain. They walked in comfortable silence at first, the autumn air crisp around them, as fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet. Alistair seemed similarly thoughtful, his expression more serious than usual, and Evelina wondered whether he too had spent the previous night turning over their conversation beneath the willow tree. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday," Alistair said finally, breaking the silence between them. "About the danger of allowing real feelings into an arrangement built upon pretense." "As have I," Evelina admitted. "I do not wish to end things between us," Alistair continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability evident in his words. "Though I understand if you feel differently. I know our arrangement began as something practical, a solution to circumstances neither of us had chosen, but I find myself unwilling to pretend any longer that my feelings toward you remain merely practical in nature." Evelina's heart pounded rapidly in her chest as she absorbed his words, torn between the joy his admission stirred within her and the fear that had guarded her heart for so long. "Alistair," she said softly, using his given name for the first time since their arrangement began. "There are things about my past you do not know. Things that led me to fear marriage in the first place, before I ever attempted my poorly executed feint at the Pembroke ball." "Then tell me," he said gently. "Whatever burden you carry, I would rather understand it than continue guessing at shadows." Evelina took a deep breath, gathering her courage, before finally speaking the words she had avoided sharing with anyone beyond her immediate family for the past 2 years. "I was engaged once before, to a man named Henry Cross. Our engagement ended rather publicly, and rather humiliatingly, when he chose to break it off mere weeks before our wedding, citing reasons that painted me in a rather unflattering light before all of society." Alistair's expression darkened slightly at this revelation, though he remained quiet, allowing her to continue at her own pace. "He claimed I had deceived him regarding certain matters of my character," Evelina continued, her voice growing quieter. "None of it was true, but the damage to my reputation proved difficult to fully repair. Even after the truth eventually emerged, I have spent the past 2 years rebuilding what little standing I retained, terrified of trusting another man's intentions after what Henry did to me." "I am sorry," Alistair said softly, "that you endured such treatment, and that it has left you carrying this fear for so long." "I tell you this not for sympathy," Evelina said, "but because you deserve to understand why I hesitate now, even as my own feelings toward you grow harder to deny. If our arrangement becomes something real, and it later falls apart, I fear the consequences to my reputation and my heart would prove far more devastating than anything I experienced with Henry." Alistair reached for her hand, holding it gently between his own. "I cannot promise you certainty, Evelina. No one can promise that in matters of the heart. But I can promise you this. Whatever happens between us, I will not treat your trust carelessly, nor will I allow society's judgment to fall unfairly upon you should circumstances change between us. Evelina studied his expression, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found only steady conviction looking back at her. Slowly, cautiously, she felt something within her begin to loosen. The careful guard she had maintained for 2 years, shifting just slightly to allow the possibility of trust to take root once more. I do not know what this means for our arrangement, she admitted quietly, but I find I no longer wish to pretend my feelings toward you remain merely practical either. A small, genuine smile spread across Alistair's face, the first Evelina had seen from him, that seemed entirely unguarded, free from the careful performance they had maintained for weeks. Then perhaps, he said, we ought to consider what an honest arrangement between us might look like, rather than continuing to hide behind the pretense we first constructed. They continued their walk through the park, in comfortable silence, the weight of shared honesty settling between them in a way that felt lighter than Evelina had anticipated. Yet even as hope began to take tentative root within her heart, a quiet unease remained at the edges of her thoughts, a nagging awareness that secrets rarely stayed buried forever, and that Henry Cross remained a variable neither of them had yet accounted for in whatever future they were beginning to imagine together. In the days following their conversation in the park, something between Evelina and Alistair shifted permanently, though neither of them announced the change publicly. Their notes grew warmer, their visits longer, and the careful performance that had once defined their public appearances began to feel less like pretense and more like the natural expression of something genuine that had grown between them. Yet Margaret Wren's suspicion had not faded, and if anything, the Dowager Duchess seemed to watch the pair with even greater scrutiny as the weeks progressed. She arrived unannounced at Evelina's home one afternoon, requesting a private conversation that Evelina could not politely refuse. "Miss Ashworth," Margaret began, seated stiffly in the drawing room while a maid poured tea between them. "I have observed my son these past weeks, and I confess my earlier suspicions have not entirely eased." "I am sorry to hear that, Your Grace," Evelina said carefully, "though I hope our continued attachment has offered some reassurance." "On the contrary," Margaret said, setting down her teacup with deliberate precision. "It has only deepened my concern. My son has changed considerably since he began courting you, Miss Ashworth. He smiles more readily, speaks of you with a warmth I have rarely witnessed in him toward anyone. This concerns me greatly." Evelina blinked, confused by the apparent contradiction in the older woman's words. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I do not understand how his happiness could be a source of concern." "Because happiness of this magnitude leaves a man vulnerable," Margaret said, her voice softening slightly, for the first time since their acquaintance had begun. "My son lost his younger brother several years ago, a loss that changed him profoundly, though he rarely speaks of it. Since that time, he has guarded himself carefully against attachments that might cause him further pain. Whatever has happened between the two of you these past weeks, it has broken through defenses I did not believe possible to breach." Evelina absorbed this revelation slowly, pieces of Alistair's occasional quietness, his careful reserve during certain conversations, suddenly falling into clearer focus. He had never mentioned a brother to her, and she found herself wondering what other burdens he carried in silence. "I did not know about his brother," Evelina admitted quietly. "I suspected as much," Margaret said. "He does not speak of it easily, even with family. If he has not yet shared this with you, perhaps that speaks to how carefully he continues to guard certain parts of himself, even as he opens others to you rather more freely than I have witnessed before. What happened to his brother, if you do not mind my asking?" Margaret's expression grew distant, sorrow flickering briefly across her composed features. Edmund was 2 years younger than Alistair, full of warmth and mischief, in ways his older brother never quite possessed. He fell ill rather suddenly 3 years ago, and despite every physician we consulted, we could not save him. Alistair blamed himself terribly, believing he ought to have noticed the signs sooner, ought to have insisted on different treatments. He has carried that guilt ever since, alongside the weight of becoming Duke, far sooner than any of us anticipated, with responsibilities he was not entirely prepared to assume. Evelina felt her heart ache at this revelation, understanding suddenly the deeper currents beneath Alistair's careful composure, the moments of quiet distance she had noticed but not fully understood. "Thank you for telling me this, Your Grace." I tell you, not merely to satisfy your curiosity, Miss Ashworth, but because I wish you to understand the stakes involved should your attachment to my son prove less than genuine, Margaret said, her tone hardening once more. He has suffered enough loss for one lifetime. If you intend to break his heart eventually, I would rather you end things now, before he becomes any more vulnerable to further pain. I have no such intention, Your Grace, Evelina said firmly. Whatever concerns you harbor about the origins of our arrangement, I promise you my feelings toward your son have become entirely genuine. Margaret studied her for a long moment, something shifting slightly in her expression, though suspicion did not entirely vanish from her gaze. I hope for both your sakes that this proves true, Miss Ashworth. Time will reveal the truth of the matter, as it always does. After Margaret departed, Evelina remained seated in the drawing room for some time, turning over the revelation about Edmund in her mind. She thought of Alistair's occasional silences, the weight he seemed to carry despite his outward confidence, and felt a fresh wave of tenderness toward him that had not existed quite so strongly before this conversation. That evening, Alistair arrived at her home for a planned visit, and Evelina found herself studying his expression more carefully than usual, searching for the grief his mother had described beneath his composed exterior. You seem thoughtful this evening, Alistair observed, as they settled into the drawing room together. Your mother visited me today, Evelina said carefully. She told me about your brother, Edmund. Alistair's expression shifted immediately, something guarded entering his gaze that Evelina had not seen directed toward her before. I see, he said quietly. I had not intended for you to learn of that from her. I am sorry if this troubles you, Evelina said gently. Though I confess, I wish you had felt comfortable sharing it with me yourself. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. It is not a subject I discuss easily, he admitted finally. Edmund's death changed everything for me. I became Duke far sooner than I was prepared for, burdened with responsibilities I had never expected to carry so young. And beneath all of that, I carried the guilt of believing I might have saved him, had I only acted differently. Your mother mentioned that guilt as well, Evelina said softly, though from everything she described, it sounds as though there was little more you could have done. Perhaps, Alistair said, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe this himself. Grief rarely listens to logic, however sound the reasoning might be. Evelina reached for his hand, holding it gently between her own, much as he had done for her weeks earlier, when she had shared her own painful history. Thank you for trusting me enough to speak of this now, even if the circumstances of my learning it were not what you intended. Alistair's expression softened slightly at her words, some of the guarded tension easing from his posture. I find myself trusting you with rather more than I anticipated when we first devised this arrangement, Evelina. It unsettles me somewhat, how easily you have found your way past defenses I believed rather impenetrable. Perhaps that is simply what happens when two people stop pretending and start being honest with one another, Evelina said quietly. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the weight of shared vulnerability settling gently between them, each of them a little more exposed than before, yet somehow less burdened for having shared these long-guarded truths. As the evening drew to a close, and Alistair prepared to depart, he paused at the door, turning back to face her with an expression of quiet determination. I believe, he said slowly, that whatever this arrangement began as, it has become something I am no longer willing to treat as temporary, Evelina. I do not say this lightly, nor do I expect an immediate answer, but I wished for you to know where my heart currently stands on the matter. Evelina felt her breath catch at his words, the weight of his sincerity settling over her like warmth spreading through a cold room. I believe my own heart has arrived at a rather similar conclusion, Alistair, she admitted softly. He smiled then, the same unguarded expression she had glimpsed briefly in the park weeks earlier, before departing into the evening with a promise to call again soon. Evelina remained standing in the doorway long after his carriage had disappeared down the street, her heart fuller than it had felt in years, though a quiet unease remained tucked beneath the joy, a persistent awareness that the past rarely remained buried forever, and that somewhere out there, Henry Cross still existed, carrying secrets of his own, that could yet unravel everything she and Alistair had so carefully begun to build together. Word of Evelina and Alistair's growing attachment spread rapidly through London society, and with it came increased scrutiny from every corner of the ton. Invitations poured into the Ashworth household at a rate Evelina had never before experienced, each hostess eager to secure the presence of the couple everyone seemed to be discussing. It was at one such gathering, a charity auction hosted by Lady Whitmore, that Evelina first noticed a face from her past among the crowd. She froze mid-conversation with an elderly countess, her attention completely diverted by the sight of Henry Cross standing near the entrance, engaged in conversation with two other gentlemen, as though his presence there was entirely unremarkable. Evelina's hand trembled slightly as she excused herself from the countess, moving quickly to find Alistair among the crowd. She located him near the refreshment table, and something in her expression must have alarmed him immediately, for he set down his glass and moved toward her without hesitation. "What has happened?" he asked quietly, noting the paleness of her face. "Henry Cross is here," Evelina whispered. "I did not expect him. I had heard he was traveling abroad." Alistair's expression darkened slightly at the name, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "Do you wish to leave? I can arrange our departure immediately, if his presence troubles you." "No," Evelina said, drawing a steadying breath. "Running would only invite further speculation. I shall simply avoid him as best I can, for the remainder of the evening." This proved considerably more difficult than Evelina anticipated. Henry seemed to seek her out deliberately as the evening progressed, positioning himself within her line of sight at every opportunity, his expression carrying a knowing smugness that made her stomach twist with dread. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that 2 years of separation might have softened whatever resentment he still harbored toward her, but his behavior tonight suggested quite the opposite. Eventually, as she stepped away from the main gathering to gather her composure near a quiet corridor, Henry approached her directly, his footsteps unhurried and confident. "Evelina," he said, his voice carrying the same falsely charming tone she remembered from their courtship years earlier. "How fortunate to find you here. I had heard rumors of your new attachment to the Duke of Wren, though I confess I did not entirely believe them until now." "Henry," Evelina said stiffly, keeping her voice as controlled as possible, despite the anger and fear churning within her. "I did not realize you had returned to London." "Only recently," he said, his eyes traveling over her with an assessing quality that made her skin crawl. "I must say, you have done rather well for yourself, considering the circumstances of our parting. A duke, no less. Society does have a curious way of forgetting past scandals when sufficient wealth and title become involved." "I would appreciate it if you kept your distance from me, Henry," Evelina said, her voice firmer now despite the tremor she felt beneath her composed exterior. Henry's smile widened, something calculating entering his gaze. "I wonder, does your duke know the full truth of what happened between us? Or have you simply allowed him to believe whatever convenient story you have constructed for society's benefit?" Evelina's blood ran cold at the implicit threat in his words. "There is nothing to tell beyond what already occurred, Henry. You broke our engagement based on false accusations. Accusations that were eventually proven baseless. Proven baseless. In the eyes of a few sympathetic friends, perhaps," Henry said dismissively. "Society at large remembers rather less generously, I imagine. Should certain details resurface publicly, particularly now that you find yourself attached to someone of such elevated status, I suspect the scandal would prove rather more damaging than it did the first time." "Are you threatening me?" Evelina asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the steel behind the words remained unmistakable. "I am simply reminding you of the precariousness of your current position," Henry said smoothly. "A word here, a suggestion there, and your Duke's family might reconsider their enthusiasm for this match rather quickly. I would hate to see you lose everything you have built, Evelina, particularly when a simple conversation between us might prevent such an outcome." Before Evelina could respond, a voice cut through the tension between them, cold and controlled, in a manner she had not yet heard from Alistair. "I believe the lady asked you to keep your distance," Alistair said, appearing suddenly beside them, his expression carefully neutral, despite the tension evident in his rigid posture. Henry's confident demeanor faltered slightly at Alistair's unexpected arrival, though he recovered quickly, offering a slight bow. "Your Grace, I was merely catching up with an old acquaintance." "Miss Ashworth's expression suggests otherwise," Alistair said, his voice remaining calm despite the clear warning embedded within it. "I would advise you to reconsider any further attempts at conversation with her this evening, or indeed at any future occasion." Henry's gaze flickered between the two of them, calculation evident in his expression as he seemed to reassess the situation before him. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense. I shall leave you both to your evening." As Henry departed, disappearing back into the crowded ballroom, Evelina felt the tension drain from her shoulders, replaced immediately by a wave of exhaustion and lingering fear. Alistair turned to her immediately, his expression softening with concern. "What did he say to you?" Alistair asked quietly. Evelina hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, though she recognized the futility of continued secrecy now that Henry's threats had become explicit. "He threatened to reveal certain details of our past engagement to society, details that could damage my reputation further, particularly given my current attachment to you." Alistair's expression hardened, though his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "What details does he threaten to reveal?" "He will likely claim I deceived him regarding my character during our engagement, the same false accusations he made when he first broke things off between us," Evelina said, her voice growing steadier as she spoke, drawing strength from Alistair's steady presence beside her. "None of it was true then, and none of it would be true now, but he seems to believe the mere suggestion, combined with your family's elevated position, might prove damaging, regardless of the truth. He will not succeed in that endeavor," Alistair said firmly. "I have resources at my disposal that Henry Cross cannot easily counter, should he attempt to follow through on his threats. I do not wish for this to become a battle fought on my behalf," Evelina said. "Whatever consequences arise from Henry's threats, they are mine to bear, not yours." Alistair took her hands gently in his own, his expression earnest, despite the anger still simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Evelina, whatever affects you now affects us both. I have no intention of standing aside while a man attempts to damage your reputation through empty threats and false accusations. Whatever comes of this, we shall face it together." Evelina felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, moved by the fierce protectiveness in his words, so different from the careful, distant concern Henry had once shown her, concern that had proven entirely hollow when circumstances turned difficult 2 years earlier. "Thank you," she whispered. "There is no need for thanks," Alistair said softly. "Only for trust, that I intend to honor the promise I made you weeks ago, that I would not allow society's judgment to fall unfairly upon you." They remained together for the rest of the evening, Alistair rarely leaving her side, his presence a steady reassurance against the lingering unease Henry's threats had stirred within her. Yet as the carriage carried her home that night, Evelina could not entirely shake the fear that Henry's threats represented merely the opening move in a far more dangerous confrontation yet to come, one that would test the strength of her newfound trust in Alistair, far more severely than anything they had yet faced together. The days following the charity auction passed in tense anticipation, Evelina waiting anxiously for Henry Cross to make good on his threats, though no immediate scandal materialized. Alistair, meanwhile, had grown quietly determined, spending several afternoons away from their usual outings, on matters he described only as necessary business. "What business occupies you so thoroughly these past days?" Evelina finally asked, when he arrived for their planned visit looking somewhat more weary than usual. "I have been making certain inquiries," Alistair said carefully, settling into the chair across from her in the drawing room, "regarding Henry Cross, and the true circumstances surrounding your broken engagement 2 years ago." Evelina's breath caught slightly. "What have you discovered?" "Rather more than I expected," Alistair said, his expression grim. "It seems Henry's own finances were in considerable disarray at the time of your engagement, far more than society ever realized. I suspect his sudden accusations against you were intended to distract from his own mounting debts, providing him a convenient excuse to end the engagement without admitting his financial troubles publicly. You believe he ended things because of money, not because of any genuine belief in the accusations he made against me?" "I believe it entirely likely," Alistair said. "I have spoken with several of his former associates, gentlemen who witnessed his financial struggles firsthand during that period. It seems he required a wealthier match than he anticipated your family could provide, once his own circumstances became precarious, and manufacturing a scandal around your supposed deception offered him a convenient exit." Evelina absorbed this information slowly, anger building steadily beneath her initial shock. "He destroyed my reputation, caused me 2 years of quiet suffering and careful rebuilding, simply to cover his own financial failures?" "It appears so." Alistair confirmed. And now, facing his own continued financial difficulties, I suspect his threats against you represent an attempt to extract some manner of payment, whether through direct blackmail or through damaging your reputation sufficiently to prevent our match, perhaps hoping to position himself favorably with my family instead, given his awareness of the connections such damage might create. What do you intend to do with this information? Evelina asked. I intend to ensure Henry Cross understands the consequences of following through on his threats, Alistair said. Quietly, if possible, though I am prepared to make matters considerably more public should he force my hand. Evelina studied him carefully, noting the controlled anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. You care for me a great deal, to pursue this matter so thoroughly on my behalf. I care for you more than I have cared for anyone, since Edmund's passing, Alistair said quietly, the admission clearly costing him something significant to voice aloud. I will not allow a man like Henry Cross to threaten your happiness, nor your reputation, while I have the means to prevent it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a note, delivered by a nervous-looking servant, who explained it had arrived urgently from Lady Whitmore's household. Evelina opened it quickly, her expression shifting to alarm as she read the contents. What is it? Alistair asked immediately. Henry has been spreading rumors already, Evelina said, her voice tight with anxiety. Lady Whitmore writes that several guests at last week's auction have begun discussing the details of our previous engagement, rather more openly than propriety allows. She warns that the story is gaining momentum rather quickly. Alistair's jaw tightened. Then we must act immediately, before the rumors grow beyond our ability to counter them effectively. What do you propose? A public event, one where we can address the matter directly, on our own terms, rather than allowing Henry to control the narrative through whispered gossip alone, Alistair said. My mother is hosting a gathering in 3 days' time. If Henry Cross intends to make his accusations public, we shall ensure the truth reaches society before his lies can take firm root. Evelina felt a flutter of nervous anticipation at the prospect, though she trusted Alistair's judgment enough to agree to his plan. What shall we say exactly? The truth, Alistair said simply. That Henry Cross ended your engagement, not due to any deception on your part, but due to his own financial troubles. Troubles he attempted to disguise through false accusations against your character. I have gathered sufficient evidence from his former associates to support this claim, should anyone question its validity. And if he denies everything, claims your evidence is fabricated to protect your own interests, then we shall have the testimonies of the gentlemen I have spoken with, men whose reputations remain considerably more trustworthy than Henry's own, particularly given his current financial desperation, Alistair said. I do not intend for this confrontation to fail, Evelina. I have prepared as thoroughly as circumstances allow. 3 days later, Evelina arrived at the Wren estate for the planned gathering, her nerves stretched tight despite Alistair's reassurances. Margaret Wren greeted her with an expression that seemed, for the first time since their acquaintance began, entirely free of suspicion, replaced instead by something resembling genuine sympathy. My son has informed me of the situation, Margaret said quietly, drawing Evelina aside before the other guests arrived. I must offer my apologies, Miss Ashworth, for the suspicion I harbored toward you these past weeks. It seems your circumstances were rather more difficult than I understood. Thank you, Your Grace, Evelina said, genuinely moved by the older woman's change of heart. Whatever unfolds this evening, know that you have my support, Margaret continued. I have grown rather fond of you these past weeks, Miss Ashworth, suspicion notwithstanding. My son's happiness has returned in a manner I feared might never occur again after Edmund's passing, and I recognize your role in that transformation clearly enough now. The gathering proceeded normally for the first hour, guests mingling and conversing as they typically would, though Evelina noticed occasional whispered glances directed her way, evidence that Henry's rumors had indeed spread further than she had hoped. She remained close to Alistair throughout, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. It was nearly 2 hours into the evening when Henry Cross himself arrived, apparently having secured an invitation through connections Evelina had not anticipated. His entrance drew immediate attention, and Evelina felt her stomach tighten as he made his way directly toward where she and Alistair stood conversing with several other guests. Your Grace, Henry said, offering a bow that carried more mockery than genuine respect. Miss Ashworth, How pleasant to see you both again. Mr. Cross, Alistair said, his tone carefully controlled despite the obvious tension in his posture. I confess I did not expect your presence this evening. I could hardly resist an invitation to such a distinguished gathering, Henry said smoothly, his gaze sweeping across the assembled guests who had begun to take notice of the exchange, particularly given the interesting rumors circulating recently regarding Miss Ashworth's rather colorful history. A hush began to fall over the nearby guests, sensing the confrontation building between the three of them. Evelina felt her heart pounding rapidly, though she forced herself to remain composed, remembering Alistair's careful preparations for exactly this moment. I believe, Alistair said, his voice carrying clearly enough for the gathering crowd to hear, that the rumors you reference deserve rather more scrutiny regarding their origin than they have thus far received. Whatever do you mean, Your Grace? Henry asked, though his confident expression flickered slightly with uncertainty. I mean, Alistair continued, that I have spent considerable time these past days investigating the true circumstances surrounding your broken engagement to Miss Ashworth 2 years ago. I have spoken with several of your former associates, gentlemen quite willing to discuss the financial difficulties that plagued you during that particular period, difficulties that provided rather more motivation for ending your engagement than any supposed deception on Miss Ashworth's part. Henry's face paled slightly as murmurs began rippling through the assembled crowd, curious guests drawing closer to witness the unfolding confrontation. I do not know what fabrications you have been told, Your Grace, but I assure you, my reasons for ending our engagement were entirely legitimate. Were they? Alistair asked, his voice hardening further. Because I have testimonies suggesting your creditors were pursuing you rather aggressively during that period. Testimonies that suggest you required a wealthier match than Miss Ashworth's family could provide, once your own circumstances grew sufficiently desperate. Manufacturing accusations against her character provided you a convenient means of ending the engagement without revealing your own financial failures publicly. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, and Evelina could see the shift in expressions around them, curiosity transforming gradually into something resembling suspicion, directed now toward Henry rather than herself. Henry's composure cracked further under the weight of the gathering scrutiny, his earlier confidence dissolving into something closer to panic. This is absurd, Henry said, though his voice carried considerably less conviction than before. I owe no one an explanation for decisions made regarding my own engagement. Perhaps not, Alistair said calmly, though I suspect society will draw its own conclusions, now that the truth has finally come to light. Conclusions rather less favorable to your reputation than the story you have been circulating about Miss Ashworth these past days. Henry glanced around at the assembled guests, clearly recognizing the shift in sentiment against him, before offering a stiff, hasty bow and retreating quickly from the gathering without further comment. As he departed, Evelina felt the tension finally begin to drain from her shoulders, replaced by a cautious relief that the confrontation had unfolded largely as Alistair had planned. Are you well? Alistair asked quietly, turning his attention back to her once Henry had disappeared from view. I believe so, Evelina said, managing a small, genuine smile despite the lingering adrenaline coursing through her. Thank you, Alistair, for defending me so thoroughly and so publicly. I would do considerably more than this to protect you, Evelina, Alistair said softly, his expression earnest, despite the attention still lingering upon them from nearby guests. I hope this evening has demonstrated that clearly enough. As the gathering slowly returned to its normal rhythm around them, conversations shifting away from the dramatic confrontation and back toward more mundane topics, Evelina felt something settle within her chest, a quiet certainty that whatever challenges remained ahead, she no longer faced them alone. In the weeks following the confrontation at the Wren estate, society's opinion shifted decisively in Evelina's favor. Whispers that had once carried suspicion now carried sympathy, and invitations arrived with even greater frequency than before, hostesses eager to include the woman whose quiet dignity had triumphed so publicly over her former fiancé's attempted sabotage. Yet Evelina found herself unable to fully relax into this newfound acceptance, aware that Henry Cross remained unpredictable, his pride wounded severely by the public unraveling of his reputation. She voiced this concern to Alistair one evening, as they walked together through her family's modest garden, the autumn air growing steadily colder as the season progressed. Do you believe he will attempt further retaliation? Evelina asked, watching her breath form small clouds in the chilled air. I believe he will consider it, Alistair admitted, though I suspect he now understands the cost of confronting us directly has grown considerably higher than he initially anticipated. Men like Henry Cross typically prefer schemes with lower risk to their own reputation. That is not entirely reassuring, Evelina said with a small, wry smile. No, Alistair agreed, returning her smile. Though I promise you this, whatever scheme he attempts next, we shall face it together, exactly as we faced the last. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Evelina's father, who approached them with an expression of careful curiosity that suggested he had something specific he wished to discuss. Your Grace, Mr. Ashworth said, offering a respectful nod toward Alistair. I wonder if I might have a private word with you, if Evelina does not object. Evelina exchanged a glance with Alistair, before excusing herself, curiosity mingling with mild apprehension, as she watched the two men move toward a quieter corner of the garden. She did not learn the substance of their conversation until later that evening, when Alistair called upon her once more, his expression carrying a nervous energy she had not witnessed from him before. Your father gave his blessing, Alistair said without preamble, once they were settled together in the drawing room. Evelina's heart began to race immediately. His blessing for what, precisely? Alistair reached for her hands, holding them gently as he knelt before her, his expression a careful mixture of vulnerability and quiet determination. Evelina, I know our arrangement began as something practical, born from mutual desperation rather than genuine affection. But these past months have shown me that whatever began as pretense has grown into something I value more deeply than I ever expected possible, particularly after the loss I carried for so long before meeting you. I would very much like to make our arrangement permanent, if you would consent to become my wife, this time entirely without pretense. Evelina felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, joy overwhelming the careful caution she had maintained for so long. Alistair, she said softly, I would be honored to accept, though I must confess something first. Alistair's expression flickered briefly with uncertainty. What is it? I believe I fell in love with you rather earlier in our arrangement than I have admitted, even to myself, Evelina said, a genuine smile spreading across her face, despite the tears threatening to fall. Perhaps as early as that afternoon, beneath the willow tree, though I was far too frightened to acknowledge it at the time. Relief and joy mingled clearly across Alistair's features, as he rose to embrace her gently. Then I believe our timing has finally aligned, Evelina. I confess I fell in love with you rather earlier as well, perhaps even that first night, when you attempted your rather poorly executed feint, and I found myself unable to look away from you afterward. They remained together for some time, savoring the quiet joy of the moment, before practical matters inevitably intruded upon their happiness. We must consider the timing of our announcement carefully, Alistair said eventually. Given the recent scandal involving Henry Cross, I would prefer our engagement announcement to reinforce the genuine nature of our attachment, rather than inviting further speculation. Perhaps a small gathering first, Evelina suggested, close family and friends, before we make a more public announcement. An excellent suggestion, Alistair agreed. My mother will undoubtedly wish to host such an occasion herself, given how thoroughly she has grown to support our match. Indeed, when Margaret Wren learned of the engagement 2 days later, her reaction carried none of the earlier suspicion that had once characterized her interactions with Evelina. Instead, she embraced her future daughter-in-law warmly, tears of genuine happiness gathering in her eyes as she offered her congratulations. I could not have chosen better for my son myself, Margaret said, holding Evelina's hands warmly between her own. You have given him back a piece of himself I feared had been lost forever after Edmund's passing. For that alone, I shall be forever grateful, regardless of whatever circumstances first brought the two of you together. The small family gathering to celebrate their engagement took place the following week, attended only by closest relatives and friends, including Lucy, who could barely contain her excitement throughout the entire evening, and Mr. Ashworth, who seemed genuinely pleased by the match, despite the unconventional circumstances of its beginning. Yet even amid this joyful celebration, a small shadow lingered at the edges of Evelina's happiness. Henry Cross remained unaccounted for, his current whereabouts and intentions unknown, following his hasty departure from the Wren estate weeks earlier. She voiced this lingering concern to Alistair as their engagement celebration drew to a close. "Do you believe he will attempt something before our wedding?" she asked quietly, as they stood together near the fireplace, watching the last of their guests depart into the cold evening air. "I have taken certain precautions," Alistair said, reassuringly. "My solicitors continue monitoring his activities, and I have ensured that any further attempts at slander or blackmail will be met immediately, with legal consequences he cannot easily withstand, given his precarious financial situation." "I hope that proves sufficient to deter him," Evelina said, though uncertainty lingered in her voice, despite Alistair's reassurances. "Whatever he attempts, Evelina, we shall face it together, exactly as we have faced every challenge since that first night at the Pembroke ball," Alistair said firmly, drawing her close against him. "I promise you this. Nothing Henry Cross attempts will succeed in separating us now, not after everything we have already overcome together." Evelina allowed herself to relax into his embrace, drawing comfort from his steady presence and quiet confidence. Yet as she gazed into the dying embers of the fireplace, she could not entirely shake the persistent feeling that their happiness remained fragile, vulnerable still to whatever desperate scheme Henry Cross might yet attempt before their wedding day finally arrived, transforming their arrangement from a carefully guarded secret into a public, permanent commitment neither of them could easily undo. The wedding preparations proceeded steadily over the following weeks, invitations sent, arrangements made, and Evelina found herself swept along in a whirlwind of fittings and planning that left little time for the anxious thoughts that had plagued her earlier. Yet 3 days before the ceremony, those anxious thoughts proved entirely justified, when a letter arrived at the Ashworth household, sealed with unfamiliar handwriting that made Evelina's stomach clench with immediate dread the moment she recognized Henry's script. She opened it alone in her bedchamber, her hands trembling slightly as she read the contents. Henry claimed to possess letters, supposedly written by Evelina during their engagement, that would prove damaging accusations he intended to bring before her wedding guests, unless she paid a considerable sum to ensure his silence. The letter specified a meeting place and time, insisting she come alone or risk immediate public exposure of the supposed evidence. Evelina's first instinct was fear, followed quickly by anger, at Henry's continued attempts to manipulate her even now, so close to the happiness she had finally found. Yet beneath both emotions, a steady clarity emerged, a recognition that she no longer needed to face such threats alone, nor did she wish to hide this latest development from Alistair, as she might once have done. She sent an urgent note requesting his immediate presence, and Alistair arrived within the hour, his expression tightening with controlled fury as he read Henry's letter. "He has no genuine letters," Alistair said firmly, once he had finished reading. "This is nothing more than a desperate bluff from a man whose schemes have already failed publicly once before." "Are you certain?" Evelina asked, though she found herself believing his assessment, even as she voiced the question. "Entirely certain," Alistair said. "I have thoroughly investigated Henry's affairs these past weeks. He possesses nothing beyond empty threats and wounded pride. However, I do not intend to simply ignore this letter either. We shall attend his proposed meeting, though not in the manner he anticipates." 2 days later, accompanied discreetly by 2 of Alistair's most trusted solicitors positioned nearby, Evelina arrived at the specified meeting location, a quiet tavern on the outskirts of London, where Henry waited alone, clearly expecting her to arrive without any support or protection. "You came," Henry said, his earlier confidence somewhat diminished compared to their previous encounters, though he attempted to maintain his composed facade. "I trust you have brought the payment I requested." "I have brought nothing of the sort," Evelina said steadily, drawing strength from the knowledge that Alistair waited just outside, along with witnesses prepared to document whatever unfolded within. "I have come instead to inform you that your threats end here, Henry, permanently." Henry's expression flickered with uncertainty. "You would risk public exposure of the letters I possess?" "You possess no letters," Evelina said firmly. "You never did. This has been nothing more than a desperate bluff from the beginning, born from wounded pride and continued financial desperation. I have grown tired of allowing your empty threats to control my happiness, Henry. It ends now." As if on cue, the tavern door opened, and Alistair entered alongside the 2 solicitors, their presence immediately draining whatever remaining confidence Henry had managed to maintain. Mr. Cross, Alistair said calmly, I believe we have some matters to discuss regarding continued attempts at blackmail and slander directed toward my future wife. Henry's face paled considerably as the solicitors began outlining, in careful legal terms, the significant consequences he faced should he continue his campaign against Evelina. Consequences that would extend far beyond mere social embarrassment into legal territory he possessed neither the resources nor the standing to survive. By the time Evelina and Alistair departed the tavern together, Henry Cross had been thoroughly, definitively defeated, his threats reduced to nothing more than empty words, carrying no genuine power over their future happiness. As their carriage carried them back toward London, Evelina finally allowed herself to release the tension she had carried since receiving his letter days earlier. It is truly finished now, she said softly, more statement than question. Truly finished, Alistair confirmed, taking her hand gently in his own. Henry Cross no longer possesses any means of threatening our happiness, Evelina. Whatever challenges remain ahead of us, they shall be challenges we choose together, rather than threats imposed upon us by others. Evelina leaned against him, exhaustion and relief mingling together as the carriage carried them steadily homeward, beneath a sky just beginning to display the first stars of evening. 3 days remained until their wedding, and for the first time since Henry's threatening letter had arrived, she found herself able to anticipate the occasion with pure, unclouded joy rather than lingering anxiety. I love you, she said quietly, the words feeling entirely natural after everything they had endured together these past months. I love you as well, Alistair replied, pressing a gentle kiss against her forehead. More than I believed myself capable of feeling again, after everything I lost before you entered my life so unexpectedly. The remaining days passed in a blur of final preparations, each moment bringing them closer to the ceremony that would transform their carefully constructed arrangement into something entirely real, entirely permanent, free at last from the shadows and threats that had complicated their journey toward this point. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, autumn sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Ashworth household as Lucy helped Evelina into her wedding gown, her fingers trembling slightly with excitement as she fastened the delicate buttons along the back. Are you nervous? Lucy asked, studying her sister's reflection in the mirror. Not nervous, Evelina said, considering the question carefully. Simply grateful, and perhaps a little astonished, that everything has led to this particular morning, after everything we endured to arrive here. You deserve every bit of this happiness, Lucy said, embracing her sister gently, careful not to disturb the careful arrangement of her gown. After everything Henry Cross put you through, after everything you feared these past 2 years, I am so glad you found the courage to trust again. I could not have done so without Alistair's patience, Evelina admitted. Nor without your constant encouragement, Lucy. Thank you for believing in this, even when I struggled to believe in it myself. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of joyful details, the small chapel filled with familiar faces, Margaret Wren seated proudly in the front pew, alongside Mr. Ashworth, both of them beaming with genuine happiness at the match neither had initially anticipated, but had come to embrace wholeheartedly. Evelina walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her eyes finding Alistair immediately where he waited at the altar, his expression carrying an emotion so raw and genuine that her own composure nearly broke at the sight. As she reached him, he took her hands gently, leaning close enough to whisper words meant only for her before the ceremony formally began. Nice attempt, he murmured, a private smile playing across his lips, echoing the very words that had first brought them together so many months earlier. Evelina laughed softly, understanding immediately the reference to that first fateful night at the Pembroke ball, when her poorly executed feint had led her directly into his arms, and, ultimately, toward this very moment. This time, she whispered back, there is no attempt required, only certainty. The ceremony proceeded smoothly, vows exchanged with genuine emotion, evident in both their voices, the small congregation offering warm applause as the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife. As they turned to face their gathered friends and family, Evelina felt an overwhelming sense of completion settle over her. The careful arrangement that had begun as mere desperate strategy, now transformed entirely into the genuine happiness she had once feared she would never find again. The wedding breakfast that followed carried on late into the afternoon, laughter and celebration filling the Wren estate as guests offered their congratulations and well wishes to the newly married couple. Margaret approached Evelina during a quiet moment, embracing her warmly as tears of genuine joy gathered in her eyes. "Welcome to our family, truly and permanently," Margaret said softly. "I confess I doubted you at first, Evelina, though I could not be more grateful now, for whatever fortune brought you into my son's life. You have given him back the joy I feared he had lost forever." "Thank you, Margaret," Evelina said, using her mother-in-law's given name for the first time, feeling the significance of the moment settle warmly between them. "For trusting me eventually, and for raising a son capable of such genuine, steady love." As evening approached and the celebration finally began winding down, Alistair found Evelina standing alone near the same garden where they had once shared their first honest conversation about the growing feelings neither of them had initially intended to develop. He approached quietly, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind as she gazed out over the darkening grounds. "Do you remember this spot?" he asked softly. "How could I forget it?" Evelina replied, leaning back against him comfortably. "This is where we first admitted that our arrangement had become something neither of us had planned for, nor entirely understood at the time. I find myself grateful every day since for that particular conversation," Alistair said. "Grateful that you trusted me enough to share your fears, and grateful that I found the courage to share my own grief with you in return, rather than continuing to hide behind careful pretense, as we had both grown so accustomed to doing." Evelina turned within his embrace to face him directly, studying the quiet happiness evident in his expression, so different from the careful, guarded composure he had displayed the very first night they met. "We built something real, from what began as nothing more than a shared act of desperation," she said softly. "I find that rather remarkable, when I consider it properly." "Perhaps the most remarkable things often begin that way," Alistair said, drawing her closer against him. "Born from necessity, then transformed by patience and honesty into something neither of us could have anticipated when we first devised our rather absurd scheme." "Absurd, and yet entirely successful," Evelina said, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Entirely successful," Alistair agreed, leaning down to press a gentle kiss against her lips, as the last light of evening faded gradually into the gathering darkness around them. They remained together in the quiet garden for a while longer, savoring the peaceful conclusion to a day filled with joy, before finally rejoining their remaining guests, to continue the celebration of a union that had begun with a poorly executed feint and a whispered observation, and had grown, through patience and honesty and courage, into a partnership built upon genuine love, mutual trust, and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges life presented them going forward, they would face them together, exactly as they had learned to do throughout their entire remarkable journey toward this joyful, well-earned conclusion.